Dead America, the Second Month, The Texas Panhandle, Part 6. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 48. Whitaker laid low on the roof overlooking the gun store, her rifle aimed at the front entrance facing her. She glanced down at her watch, seeing there were 6 minutes left on the timer, and 14 minutes since Hammond had gone on his run. She hadn't heard too much in the way of gunfire since he'd left, which filled her with a little bit of hope that he was okay. She shook her head, putting that little bit of doubt out of her head, almost ashamed that she'd let it creep in there in the first place. Hammond was the most capable soldier she'd ever served with, and given what they'd done over the past 6 weeks or so, she was confident that a handful of small-town bikers weren't going to be the end of him. Meanwhile, across the highway and up a couple of blocks, Hammond ducked down by a window inside of a building. He wiped blood off of his knife, freshly there from a zombie he'd left in the back of the store. He breathed a little heavy, all from the running and fighting up to that point. Really should have told Whitaker 30 minutes instead of 20, he thought to himself. Didn't realize this was going to be such a chore. Hammond looked out the window, 2 blocks short of the target building where the bikers had taken up residence. There were a handful of ghouls in the lot between the 2 buildings, spread out pretty far. The building across was a single story, with a couple of big windows and a door. Hammond studied the building carefully, trying to see if there was any movement inside, but he couldn't see any. This looks too easy, he muttered, shaking his head. He knew it was probably going to be rough, but he got up and prepared to move. He stood by the door, preparing to open it, cracking it just a smidge to look outside. There was a zombie within arm's reach that didn't notice him, with a couple more just past him. Then it was relatively smooth sailing to the other building. In a single motion, Hammond opened the door and reached out for the zombie, grabbing it by the shirt and yanking it into the store, slamming the door behind him and trapping it inside. He darted forward, knocking the 2 creatures to the ground before moving quickly towards the next building. He did a mall walk rather than an outright run, not wanting to draw attention to himself. As he approached the door, he did it cautiously, gripping his handgun and knife, wanting to be ready for anything. He peeked in through the window, seeing it was a general goods store. He looked around, not seeing much of anything in the way of movement. He reached down, trying the door, but it was locked. He tried to force it open, but had no luck. He peeked in through the glass, finding it barred from the inside, out of reach even if he broke the glass. The rattling on the door was enough to draw some attention to him, the moans intensifying as they shambled towards him. He turned to see, and there was only 1 zombie within 10 yards. However, its buddies were slowly moving his way too, a good 5 to 10 yards back from the lone creature. The sergeant looked at the large plate glass window, going over and giving it a smack, realizing it wasn't the safety stuff. "Skimping out, huh?" he quipped. "Appreciate that." He took a few steps away from it, waiting for the zombie to get close to him. He waited for it to lunge at him before making his move, using the momentum to build up a head of steam. He lifted and shoved the creature, which went headfirst through the glass, creating a horrible racket as glass shards collapsed to the floor all around it. Hammond hopped up and into the store, jamming his blade into the back of the creature's head as he moved inside. He glanced back as he moved further inside, as several zombies followed him through the break. He didn't panic, simply casually moved through to the other side of the interior, glancing at his watch as he went. 3 minutes left on the clock. "Better pick up the pace," he muttered. When he reached the back room, he shut the door behind him and stood by the exit door. He peeked outside, finding the 2-story target building. It looked like a small office building, with glass all around the bottom and office windows up top. He studied the bottom floor, finding 1 biker roaming the area, but couldn't see anybody upstairs. "I know you're there," he murmured to himself, "but if I can't see you, that means you can't see me." He checked his assault rifle, readying it. "You will soon, though." There were a couple dozen zombies between him and the building, with several of them pressed up against the glass of the office building, getting a glimpse of the biker inside. He tried to plot his course through the zombies, but another problem arose. How was he going to get into the building itself? "Doors are certainly going to be locked," he thought. "These aren't the brightest guys in the world, but they should be able to manage that." He tilted his head back and forth, hemming and hawing over the situation. Could just take the direct approach, go through them and the window. That biker wouldn't know what hit him. He paused, envisioning possible outcomes of that scenario. But that would make the bottom floor pretty infested. Still, it was manageable assuming the stairwell is self-contained. He looked into the building, trying to see if there was a center staircase. He couldn't see one, leading him to believe that it was an emergency one. "Okay, direct approach," he thought, and checked his watch. There was 1 minute left. Don't have time to figure out a better plan anyway. He readied his rifle, looking across the lot and planning his movements. There was a clear path through the mob, with the zombies against the glass providing some visual cover to the first-floor biker. The sergeant stayed at the ready, listening for the diversion shots. Several seconds went by before his watch beeped, and almost immediately the firing from Whitaker began. The biker on the first floor looked out, watching as the truck being loaded up with weaponry lost its front 2 tires. Hammond burst out the door, running hard towards the zombies against the glass. As he got within 10 yards, he paused for a brief second, raising his rifle and unloading on the zombies. He ripped through the backs of their heads, shattering the glass on the other side. He built up a head of steam, lowering his shoulder and planting it into the small of one of their backs, crashing through the glass and into the office building. He landed on the back of a zombie as it squirmed under the weight with snarling agitation. Hammond hopped up, leaving the ghoul behind as bullets flew his way from the biker inside. He took cover behind cubicles, navigating his way through the maze of desks and cheaply made walls. The biker moved around, occasionally firing off towards the broken window to take out a zombie. This let Hammond get a read on where the biker was, which seemed to be up towards the highway-facing windows of the building. He worked his way down the cubicle aisle, staying low and peeking out from behind cover. He aimed his rifle towards the biker who stood at the top of the aisle. There was a mob of zombies by the window he stood next to, attracted by the gunfire. The sergeant aimed for the biker's leg, firing once and sending a round straight through his upper thigh. His opponent let out a scream, falling to the ground and clutching at his new wound. "You got 2 choices," Hammond bellowed. "Keep shooting at me, or get to a supply closet and lock yourself up. Your call." He kept his sights on the man from behind cover, still concealed from the bleeding biker. His opponent looked at his gun, then back at the glass behind him, which was cracking due to the bullet and weight of the monsters outside. He left the gun on the ground and pulled himself up, hobbling towards the back of the building. Hammond stayed quiet, letting him make all the noise, drawing the zombies coming in from the broken window outside. He moved as silently as he could through the cubicle aisles, staying hidden from the zombies that were intently focused on their moving meal, almost like sharks that could smell blood in the water. Hammond worked his way to the back of the building, finding the stairwell door which was closed tight. He gently pulled it open, expecting resistance on the other side, but relieved to find it empty. He moved up the stairs, gun aimed up, not sure if the gunfire below had alerted the bikers upstairs to his presence. He made it to the landing, and still met no resistance, so he moved to the door that was sealed shut. He planted his back against the cinder block wall before reaching down to the floor. He hesitated for a bit. If it were me, and this was the only way up, I'd be on the other side of this door, he thought, and slung his rifle over his shoulder. He pulled out his handgun before reaching down to grasp the handle. He slowly turned it, keeping the sound to a minimum, finally throwing it open and ripping his hand back. As soon as the door opened, bullets ripped through it, sparking against the metal and sending shrapnel towards him. The impact was enough to push the door further open for a few seconds. The gunfire didn't last long, and as soon as it stopped, Hammond reached inside and opened fire. He moved fast, firing wildly as he went, not knowing how many gunmen were inside or where they were. But he knew if he didn't make his move now, he wasn't getting in, because if they didn't see a body, they'd just wait. Bullets flew in the upstairs office, which had a smaller layout to the first floor, row after row of cubicles. The lighting was dim, only coming from the fading sunlight outside. Still, he was able to identify 2 shooters, one on each side of the aisle directly across from the door. He aimed towards the one to his right, firing several times while diving in that direction. He managed to catch the biker in the throat with a shot, dropping him. Hammond hit the ground as the other biker adjusted his aim towards him. Bullets ripped through the cubicle as he crawled along the ground. The biker yelled, but Hammond couldn't make it out. He wasn't particularly interested in what the man had to say anyway. He crawled along the ground to the next aisle before getting back to his feet, staying low and crouch running all the way to the other side. The sunlight came in from the highway side of the building, making it more difficult to see that way. The gunfire subsided for the moment, with both men in a tense standoff, listening for clues to where the other was. Hammond ducked down in the last cubicle on the line, looking along the desk and finding a snow globe on it. He holstered his handgun and pulled out his rifle, knowing he was a better shot with it in the distance, and he could hear the biker still at the other end of the building. The sergeant contemplated for a moment, trying to predict which direction the biker would be looking. He flung the snow globe over towards the side of the room, opposite of where he'd gone. As soon as it hit, his opponent turned and fired a shot. Hammond popped up, finding the man in view with his rifle, and fired 1 round, which hit him center mass, and dropped him instantly. The sergeant listened closely, hearing choked moans of pain for a few moments, before silence. He moved slowly to inspect the area and found both men dead on the ground. He did a quick sweep of the room, making sure he was alone, then made his way over to the highway window to look at the gun store. There were still hundreds of zombies in front of the building, with some heading towards the office he was in and staying glued to the gun store as the noise of them loading up the truck kept their attention. He studied the truck, finding the front tires flat. "That's some good shooting, Whitaker," he commended, and took a knee. He inspected the glass window in front of him, which was floor to ceiling and not the safety stuff. He tapped on it lightly a few times to confirm. "Couple shots and this thing is toast," he murmured, and looked over to where Whitaker was. She was looking up at him, and he gave her a thumbs up, letting her know he was okay. "Okay, we're in position," he said to himself. "Now all we can do is sit and wait on Axton to make his move." Chapter 2. Nearly half an hour had passed since Sparks detonated the Rufus device and began pulling away zombies from in front of the gas station. They were beginning to trail off, partly because the explosions in the distance had started back up, pulling more and more away. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to clear them out. There were still about 50 zombies who refused to leave the front of the gas station. With the front windows smashed, it opened the way for a couple dozen to pile into the store, and they were making enough of a racket to keep the mob outside entranced. Sparks continued to sit up on the silo, overlooking everything. She could look out towards Dalhart, watching the mob vanish into the darkness now that the sun was behind the horizon. Luckily, the moon would be shining bright soon, and it was a clear, crisp night. "How the hell are we going to pull this one off?" she asked herself with a sigh. She stared into the distance, knowing that they'd have to deal with the mob as well as the remaining convicts and bikers. But first things first, she had to get Jackie and Landry out of the gas station. She turned her focus to that situation, studying the area and finding that not only were zombies in the front, but also around the sides of the building as well. She couldn't waste ammunition or else risk running out for the battle ahead. To make things worse, she didn't have a way to communicate with Landry and Jackie. An epiphany hit her like a battering ram, and her eyes widened. The office below might have something useful. She thundered back down the stairs, pausing at the office door to make sure there was nothing inside. Any zombie that would have been interested in that place seemed to be long gone, either with the main mob or trying to get into the gas station. She looked around, hoping to find something useful. Finally, she found a couple of cheap radios on a filing cabinet. They weren't good for much more than a few 100 yards, perfect for a facility that size, and also perfect for what she needed to use it for. Sparks quickly tested them, making sure the batteries were good, and relieved to find they were. She pocketed one of them before going to the front door and looking out towards the gas station. It was about 40 yards, with the closest zombie 20 yards away with its back towards her. She looked side to side, making sure she could get out and back without any real danger. Finally, she decided to go for it. Sparks opened the door and ran as hard as she could towards the gas station, getting to the middle of the road before any zombies noticed what she was doing. They turned towards the noise, arms outstretched and moaning, but far away as she threw the walkie-talkie with everything she had. She didn't wait to see if it landed on the roof, quickly turning and rushing back into the office, locking the door and quickly going back outside and up the stairs for extra safety, and to stay out of sight. She made it up a few flights and looked down at the roof. Both Jackie and Landry were just sitting there, not doing anything outside of stargazing. Sparks pulled out her walkie-talkie and brought it to her lips. "Behold, the voice of God," she said, adding extra drama and gravitas to her voice. "Bow down before your master and repent your sins." She cracked a smile as the duo startled, looking around in confusion. "God says you're getting warmer," she said as Landry moved closer to the radio. "Warmer. On fire." He found it and picked it up, bringing it to his mouth. "Yeah, God. I'd like to file a formal complaint," he drawled. "Several, actually." "I sincerely apologize for the lack of, length," she joked, keeping her voice as serious as she could. "End of the workday. We hadn't restocked yet, and I needed to get home." Landry chuckled good-naturedly. "Keep pushing, and I'm going to have to whip it out just to prove you wrong," he warned. Okay, you win," Sparks said, losing the God voice. "But just for the record, I would be more than willing to call your bluff. I just wouldn't want to risk your, because I'm pretty sure Jackie wouldn't be too pleased if she was presented with it." He glanced back at the punk rocker in question, who sat playfully tapping her knife. "Appreciate the consideration there, miss," he said sweetly. Sparks laughed. "Any time," she replied. "So where the hell did this thing come from?" he asked. "Found it in the office downstairs," Sparks replied. "I stepped out to chuck it up to you before running back to safety." Landry nodded appreciatively. "Ballsy. I like it," he said. "Glad you like ballsy, because it's going to require some to get out of this mess," she warned. Another detonation went off in the distance, and Sparks looked out, seeing the lingering light that was getting close to town. "Can you see Dalhart?" Jackie asked, and Sparks glanced over at them, finding she'd snatched the radio from the soldier. "Kind of," Sparks replied. "I can't tell how close they are, but they're going to be there soon." "Any idea how to get us out of here?" Jackie asked. Landry walked over to the back of the store, staring down at the small handful of ghouls back there. "Not too many of them in the back," he called. "Pretty sure we can get to the ground and shoot 'em." "But what about the ones in the front?" Jackie asked. "Won't they come around?" "Not if they're dealt with," Sparks cut in. "Almost afraid to ask," Landry muttered. "I still have one of the devices Rufus gave us," she continued. "I can throw it to the front of the store when you make your move."
It'll take them out, but you'll have to make sure you're off the roof by then. If I know Rufus, this thing will level that building if I get it inside."
Landry motioned for Jackie to follow him over to the edge. They looked down at the pavement with some grass a few yards away. It was easily an 8-foot drop down. "If we get up a running start, can you make it to the grass?" the soldier asked. She stared down her nose at him.
"Can I make it to the grass?"
she asked dryly.
"Probably."
She raised a finger.
"Can I make it to the grass without breaking my legs? I sincerely doubt it."
"Don't worry, I'll teach you how to land," he said with a grin. She chuckled, shaking her head.
"You're going to teach me to parkour roll in 5 minutes on top of a roof?" she asked.
He pointed to a raised compressor on the roof with a nod. "It's not that hard, and you only have to do it once," he said. "Plus, it's not that big of a drop, and you'll be going horizontally, which is going to help." Another explosion went off in the distance, and Jackie chewed her lip, knowing that there was no time for other options.
"Okay, let's do this," she finally said,
letting out a deep breath between her teeth.
"But no upbeat pep talks," she added, raising her finger again. "You start praising me like a toddler standing up for the first time, and I swear to God I will smack you."
"Fair enough," Landry said, and snatched the walkie-talkie from her hand with a smirk. "Okay, Sparks, we got a plan. We just need a few minutes to get ready."
"Copy that. I'll get in position and wait on your signal,"
Sparks replied, beginning the descent down the stairs. Landry led Jackie over to the compressor, holding out his hand to her. "Don't worry, I'm not making a move," he joked. "I'm just going to walk you through it."
"Put your hands wherever you need to,"
she said as she took his hand and stepped up onto the compressor. She paused.
"Until we're off this roof,"
she amended. He chuckled. "Don't worry, I'll be a perfect gentleman," he said. "Now, loosen up your limbs." He walked her through the hit-and-roll technique, showing her how to throw her weight to her dominant side and absorb the shock of a fall to land safely. They did it in slow motion, with him manipulating her limbs in the way they needed to go, and then a few times with him holding her hand to guide her positioning as she fell. Finally, she jumped on her own, curling her legs and arms into an awkward roll. It wasn't the most graceful, but it worked.
"I think that's as good as it's going to get," she huffed. "I'm afraid if I keep going, I'm going to hurt myself up here."
He nodded. "Okay," he agreed, and his tone turned deathly serious, a rarity for the soldier. "Now, I want you to listen carefully. When we land, the only thing I want you to worry about is running back towards the horses."
"But what about Sparks?"
she asked, gaping at him. "Trust me, that girl is going to outlive us all," Landry assured her, raising his palms. "She can handle herself, and I'm going to handle any of those things that start coming our way. You just focus on running. You clear?" Jackie took a deep breath and nodded.
"Yeah, I got you," she said.
"Okay then," Landry said with a grin, and pulled out the walkie-talkie. "Sparks, we're ready here when you are. What's your 20?
"In the silo office,"
came the reply. "Good," Landry replied. "So once you throw that thing, what's your plan?"
"I'm going to stay on the highway leading into town, getting a few 100 yards away from the mob," she explained. "I'm hoping that the explosion will hold any still-standing stragglers. I'll wait on the two of you to get to me with the horses."
"We can do that," he said, and glanced at Jackie. "You ready to do this?" he asked.
"Nope,"
she quipped, popping the P with extra drama. "Fantastic," Landry said with a grin, and raised the radio once again. "We're going on your signal."
"Stand by,"
Sparks said. Landry and Jackie got into position in the middle of the roof, with plenty of room to build up a head of steam. "Remember, land, roll, and run," he reminded her. "Yep," she replied, making sure her limbs were nice and loose, eyes focused ahead of her. Landry heard the tone in her voice and saw the determination in her face, and stopped giving instructions. The two of them stood ready, like sprinters preparing to spring out of the blocks. "Go!" Sparks cried, and the duo immediately took off running for the edge of the roof. Jackie planted her foot at the edge
and leapt out as far as she could, and the ground came so fast. But she landed hard before sinking into the roll, tweaking her ankle at the hit. She slid across the ground on her back in a rough, awkward way. Landry didn't fare much better, avoiding injury but also landing a bit awkwardly. He was a little shaken, but quickly hopped up, raising his rifle and aiming back towards the zombies who were only a few yards away from them. He didn't hesitate, immediately pumping round after round into their heads. He gave them plenty of room to operate before turning to Jackie, who was struggling to get to her feet. He leaned down, taking her arm and pulling her to a standing. "You good?" he asked. "Yeah," she nodded jerkily. "Let's go," he urged, and fired a few more shots towards the zombies that were shambling towards them as they moved back towards the horses. Meanwhile, just after giving the signal, Sparks emerged from the silo office, walking with a solid stride while lighting up the device from Rufus. Once the fuse was lit, she built up a head of steam, running towards the building before letting it go. She aimed low, just over the heads of the ghouls so that it didn't go onto the roof. The lit fuse brightened the way as the device flew over the mob, vanishing into the store as it slipped in underneath the canopy. As soon as she let it go, Sparks turned and started running up the highway as several zombies turned their attention towards her. There were only a couple of creatures in the way on the road, which were easily dodged by slightly adjusting course. When she was about 30 yards up, the device went off, sending a deafening blast and a fireball up into the air. Night turned to day as the underground gas tanks ruptured, sending a huge stream of flaming liquid into the air. Sparks glanced back, finding that the zombies that had been chasing her were either turning around or being coated in flames, falling from the sky. She didn't waste much time observing the carnage she'd created, taking off at a sprint. Several hundred yards later, the fireball was still lingering in the sky, lighting her path on the road. She kept her head on a swivel, making sure she was alone on the highway, which she seemed to be. Finally, she stopped to catch her breath, looking around and back towards the small one-stoplight town. The scene was horrific, with charred bodies smouldering, flames beginning to spread, and just a mess of carnage. A few moments later, Landry and Jackie came riding up on the horses, bringing hers along with them. "Good job, Sparks," Landry commended brightly. "You blew up a town." She shrugged. "What can I say? Rufus knows how to make them," she quipped as she swung up into the saddle. "What the hell did you hit?" Jackie demanded. "Looks like the underground storage tank got punctured," Sparks replied. "Well, whatever you did, it worked," Jackie breathed, shaking her head. "Yeah, by blowing up a town," Landry repeated, though there was a hint of awe and little boy's wonder in his voice. "How about I make up for it by going to save a town?" Sparks asked, cocking her head. He made a show of pretending to be deep in thought for a moment, and then gave her a playful thumbs up. "Sounds good to me. Let's do it," he said. She nodded and turned her horse, and the trio sped off towards Dalhart. Chapter 3. Hammond and Whitaker kept vigil over the gun store, just sitting in their perched positions, watching the zombies wander aimlessly on the road. The crowd immediately in front of Hammond had died down a bit, several filtering into the office building he was in. The only time he left his post at the window was to go back to the stairwell door and drag a desk over to it. It was unlikely one of those creatures would be able to get into the stairwell in the first place, and virtually impossible for them to get to the second floor and open it up. But it wasn't for them. He laid out every single oddly shaped item he could find onto the table. Lamps, coffee mugs, anything that would make noise if it moved. If the wounded biker decided to make a play for him, he'd have to do some work and potentially alert him to his presence. So far, though, it had been quiet, with only the faint sounds of moaning going on outside. Finally, there was some movement at the store,
and he watched one of the bikers pull back one of the boxes they'd loaded into the back of the pickup truck. The vehicle was backed about halfway into the opening, blocking it from zombies. "About time you boys got moving," Hammond muttered. He grabbed his assault rifle, double-checking the ammo to make sure he was locked and loaded. The biker pulled back several boxes and climbed into the back, working his way towards the front. But as soon as he emerged from the cover of the storage room door, the zombies beside him grew excited for fresh meat. The truck had a lift kit, so he wasn't in any danger of being grabbed, but it would be an awkward trip. "This ought to be good," the sergeant said with a chuckle. He watched as the biker got to the top of the cab, surveying the situation and not finding a speck of pavement for him to step down onto. He pulled out a hammer, swinging it into the driver's side window, and after a couple of swings, he managed to shatter the glass. "Time for the biker gymnast," Hammond said, holding his fire because he was curious to see if the guy could pull this off. Much to his surprise, the burly man managed to contort himself in through the window, avoiding the outstretched hands of the creatures reaching up. He gave a celebratory honk of the horn, letting the others inside know he was ready to go. Hammond glanced over at Whitaker, who was also in firing position, just waiting to strike. The sergeant did the same, training his sights on the driver. Even though the truck didn't have front tires, they still had enough power to get through the immediate mob and out of town. Or they would have, if Hammond wasn't watching over them like a hawk. "Come on, pull out, you know you want to," he cooed as he watched through the scope. He glanced up from it as 3 other men got into the back of the truck, smacking on the boxes that were ready to go. As soon as the truck pulled out, Hammond fired once, shattering the window in front of him. He immediately opened fire, pumping several rounds down towards the cab of the truck. Whitaker did the same, aiming for the driver. The guy never stood a chance, with 2 trained killers focused on him. He was quickly riddled with bullets, his dead foot slamming onto the gas, the truck accelerating quickly. The vehicle rolled over several zombies before slamming into the building that Whitaker was in, sending the 3 men in the back lurching forward and much of their cargo spilling out. Hammond was forced back behind cover as the 3 men gathered themselves and began firing wildly in his direction. A few of the bullets hit the windows next to him, shattering them as well. The sergeant made it behind some light cover, one of the support beams between the glass, laying flat and aiming his rifle. He fired a few more times, which the bikers didn't seem to notice while they were fighting for their lives. Hammond watched the 3 men try to run back into the gun shop, firing wildly at zombies and shoving them aside as they went. The desperation was palpable, so he picked off a few of the ghouls that were in their path, helping them run back to the store. Even with his help, there was too much resistance for them, as the biker bringing up the rear was tripped up by a zombie, falling flat on his face. The other 2 men continued to run, not able to stop without ending their own lives. The man was swallowed up by a mob of ghouls, and all Hammond could do was aim his rifle towards him and fire a mercy round, hitting him in the back and putting him down for good. He aimed towards his head, but didn't worry about wasting the bullet because there wasn't going to be enough of him left to be a runner threat, with the amount of zombies eating him. He went back to covering the 2 bikers as they raced back to the gun store. He fired a few more times, picking off some of the mob and allowing the men to push through. Once they vanished inside the store, his ability to help ended, and he watched helplessly as zombies poured in through the opening. Gunshots popped off from inside before falling silent. Several moments went by before the radio clicked on. "Hey, Hammond? You there?" Whitaker asked. He maneuvered the walkie-talkie to his lips. "Yeah, I'm here," he said. "Were you really covering them?" she asked, her tone dry. "I was indeed," the sergeant admitted, as if challenging her to argue with him. "They get into the store?" she asked. "2 of them did," he replied. "I heard some gunshots, but everything is silent now, and those things are still pouring into the building." He thought for a moment before holding his rifle out the window and firing a few shots towards the back of the pack, taking out a few ghouls and making some noise to draw them away. "Well, that helped a little," he said as a few peeled away from the pack.
"Assuming they're still kicking in there?" Whitaker said.
"Much to my surprise, ma'am, we still are,"
Axton drawled, cutting into their conversation. "Good to hear your voice, Axton," Hammond said.
"I swear, Sergeant, you are one schizophrenic motherfucker. You know that?"
the gang leader accused, clearly agitated.
"You're sparing my men, you're killing men, and then you help us get to safety after cutting down one of my men. I just can't get a read on you."
"That's a strange way of saying thank you, but I suppose it will do," Hammond said with a smirk.
"Thank you?"
Axton snapped.
"You blew the head off of my driver."
The sergeant sighed. "I told you from the get-go. I couldn't let you get away with the guns," he said, letting regret encompass his tone. "It's nothing personal. But I'm here to do a job, and I'm going to do it. Doesn't mean I'm an angel of death, slaughtering everyone who comes my way. I only kill who I have to kill, which is why you're still alive and kicking." There was a long silence, as if the gang leader were letting the words sink in, or gathering himself.
"Fair enough, Sergeant," he said, and he sounded much calmer this time. "Still, if your aim was not to kill us, the plan leaves a little to be desired."
Hammond cocked a brow. "How so?" he asked. "You're still talking to me, aren't you?"
"Why, that is a true statement. You and I are conversing due in large part to your crack shooting," Axton admitted. "However, I don't think this is going to be a lengthy conversation."
"I have no place to be," Hammond quipped.
"That's good to know, because if you're being truly honest about wanting to keep us alive, then I'm afraid we're going to need some assistance,"
Axton said. The sergeant had assumed that was the case. "Caught the eye of some undead beauties, I take it," he drawled.
"Yeah, you could say that," came the reply. "As we speak, I'm looking at a couple dozen of the ugliest mofos you've ever laid eyes on, and they're all staring at me through the glass of the manager's office door."
Hammond nodded. "Is it secure?" he asked.
"Well, Jimbo and I have a desk pushed up against the door, and the glass seems to be holding for the time being. But we don't exactly have a way out of here," Axton explained.
The sergeant adjusted his position into a more relaxed pose. "Well, that's good," he said.
"Good?"
Axton snapped. "Yes, sir," Hammond replied. "It's good because it'll give us a chance to talk. It seems as though we both have something the other wants." The gang leader sighed.
"That a fact now?"
he drawled. "Oh, I believe so," Hammond said. "You have the guns and ammunition I want, and I'm the only chance you have at leaving that place alive. So what do you say we work us out a little deal here?" There was a pause before he came back.
"Well, after talking it over with my attorney Jimbo here,"
Axton said,
"he has advised me that it would be in both our interests to hear what you're offering."
"He's carefully earning his retainer today," Hammond joked. "As for what I want, it's simple. I want what was promised to me by the leadership in Dalhart. I know I didn't make that deal with you, but seeing as how I'm here due in part to you, I figured you wouldn't mind upholding that deal."
"You can have as much as you can carry as far as I'm concerned,"
Axton assured him.
"So what we get?"
The sergeant took a deep breath. "Here's what I'm going to give you," he said firmly. "When Jackie and my people finish off your convict buddies attacking Dalhart, they're going to bring back a few party favors that will allow us to pull those things away from you."
"And after that?"
Axton cut in.
"Because I'm going to let you know right now, I have no intention of going back to jail, especially with the dishonest shit that Ditko pulled."
Hammond shook his head. "Don't worry. I have no intention of handing you over to them," he said. Axton chuckled.
"Sergeant, I've been around the block enough to know when a deal is too good to be true," he said. "There isn't any way in hell you're just going to turn me loose after all this. especially after I've shot at you on multiple occasions."
"Some of my best friends have shot at me," Hammond quipped with a shrug.
"I can confirm that,"
Whitaker cut in. The sergeant laughed. "See what I mean?" he said.
"Ma'am, I'm not trying to imply that you're a liar," Axton said slowly. "But if you really took a shot at the good sergeant here, he'd be walking with a limp at the very least."
She laughed. "Warning shots are a thing, you know," she said.
"Looks like the sergeant is smart enough to listen to you once you made your point,"
Axton drawled.
"Oh, is he?" she agreed.
"So, what do you propose, Sergeant?" the gang leader asked. "Once you get us out of here, that is."
"How do you boys feel about a road trip?" Hammond asked.
Hammond,"
Whitaker cut in, surprise and warning in her tone. "I know what I'm doing," the sergeant said firmly. "Axton?"
"Gas isn't exactly plentiful these days, but we're not opposed to it, provided we're not on a tight timetable," came the reply. "Where are we going?"
Hammond smirked. "How do you feel about El Paso?" he asked.
"Hot as hell and good Mexican food," Axton drawled. "What's not to love?"
"Hammond, Channel 6, Whitaker snapped. "Axton, you mind hanging out for a moment?"
"Ma'am, we're not going anywhere. You take your time,"
came the polite reply. Hammond switched channels and brought the radio to his lips. "What's on your mind, Whitaker?" he asked, though he knew exactly what she was going to say.
"Just want to make sure I'm understanding your plan here," she said, sarcasm rising in her tone. "You're inviting a violent biker gang to come over and hang out like it's a third-grade playdate?"
He took a deep breath. "Just hear me out," he said slowly, hoping to chill some of her fire. "Rodriguez is having a hell of a time getting the cartel under his control. You know there's been infighting, not to mention a significant portion of them who aren't really fond of us, since, we murdered their boss and their son."
"True,"
she agreed, though she still didn't sound convinced when she continued.
"And you think Axton is the answer?"
"I think he's an unexpected card that Rodriguez's opposition would never see us playing. Not to mention it solves our problem up here," he said. "Plus, he can bring down more weapons. It's a win-win." She paused for a beat.
"You think we can trust him?"
she finally asked. He tilted his head back and forth. 70-30, he finally said.
"We've moved forward with plans on lesser odds," she admitted.
"That's my thought," Hammond said. "I do trust Jackie, and with what she's told us, Axton has been a man of his word. I think it's worth the gamble."
"All right," Whitaker agreed with a sigh. "But you have to tell Landry."
"Deal," Hammond said. "Now let's not keep them waiting." He switched back to Axton's channel and clicked the button. "Still with us?" he asked.
"As long as you'll have us,"
the gang leader replied.
"So, what's the verdict?"
"I'm on board with whatever Hammond wants," Whitaker said.
"Fantastic," Axton quipped. "So, there was something about El Paso in there."
"Yep, El Paso," Hammond confirmed. There was a pause before Axton asked,
"You mind elaborating a little bit? Because as much as I know you enjoy my company, I doubt you're inviting us down for a social visit."
"I'm happy to give you the full backstory while we wait, if you want," Hammond said. Another pause.
"Well, before I commit us to it, you mind nutshelling it for me?" Axton asked.
"Our small town of survivors has been fighting against the Rivas cartel since before the whole apocalypse began," Hammond explained. "A couple weeks ago, we managed to bump off the head of the cartel and his son, and, inadvertently, we may have started a civil war within the organization, with our ally currently struggling to keep his throne at the top." Axton took a deep breath.
"So, you want me and my gang to ride clear across the state to the Mexican border to help you fight one of the most well-equipped independent armies on the continent?"
he asked dryly. "Pretty much, yeah," Hammond said. The gang leader laughed.
"What do you think, Jimbo?"
he asked, while still holding the talk button open.
"You want in on that?"
There was a clear but faint,
"Hell yeah,"
in the background.
"Fuck it. If Jimbo wants to go, then we'll go," Axton drawled.
It's kind of a shame I didn't think of this earlier, you know, before killing half your men, Hammond said. Axton laughed.
Half my men?
More laughter.
Sergeant! You think I would commit my entire force to this operation? This is just a tiny fraction of my followers. Hell, most of my gang is further east, raising some hell and raiding the abandoned towns that way.
While that's good to hear, it's a little surprising to be honest, Hammond said slowly.
Now, Sergeant, you're really close to offending me,
Axton said, though his tone was playful. Hammond shook his head. Has nothing to do with your leadership ability, he amended. It's just that this town is so small. I didn't expect such a large gang.
You answered your own question, Axton said. This is a small town. You have any idea how boring it gets up here when you're not drinking or whoring around?
The sergeant chuckled. Didn't consider that, he admitted. Guessing you provided that.
In spades, sir,
Axton declared.
In spades.
Hammond laughed. Well, I'll remember that when you get down to El Paso, he promised. I've been known to throw a few back myself.
Like that time we were on leave a few years ago?
Whitaker cut in. The sergeant narrowed his eyes. Do not tell that story, he commanded.
I'm adding this story in as part of my deal,
Axton piped up. You're willing to risk your life to hear this story? Hammond asked.
It is a very good story, Whitaker promised.
I'm going to go with the sharpshooter on this one, Sergeant,
Axton said. Hammond laughed and tossed the walkie-talkie down in his lap, shaking his head as Whitaker began to talk. He tuned it out, thinking about how he very well may have just made a deal with the devil. But it wasn't the first devil he'd made deals with, and this time he'd be able to vet them. Unlike the old days in the sandbox when the higher-ups were calling the shots, if Axton stepped out of line, he knew he could do something about it. Chapter 4. The group rode up towards Dalhart through the open terrain of the desert. The train was to their right, by the highway, the zombie mob having already moved around it. They had a straight shot towards downtown and the neighborhood. As they rode, a rifle shot went off in the distance, putting them on edge. They looked to their right, finding a lone cowboy standing on the top of the train, waving frantically to get their attention, barely visible in the moonlight. Let's go, Landry urged, and led the charge towards the waving cowboy. As they approached, he lowered his gun and cupped a hand around his mouth.
What in the holy hell is going on?
He yelled.
Hoping you could tell us, Landry replied. You got a radio on you?
The cowboy nodded.
Yeah, and it's going crazy, he called. Too many voices to make clearly half the damn time.
Landry motioned for it.
Give it here, he said. What have you been able to make out? Got a whole mess of those things going up towards town, came the reply as he tossed the radio down to him. Had some explosions go off, too.
Any idea where?
Sparks asked.
Heard something about a couple of horses being blown up,
the cowboy replied, as more gunshots peppered the distance.
And somebody taking shots at my boys on the train.
How many people are still in town?
Jackie demanded.
And where?
Sparks added. The cowboy shook his head.
We have a flop house for some of the guards in the neighborhood just short of downtown. Big yellow house on Den Rock. Leads right into the heart of downtown.
They going to be there now? Landry asked.
The cowboy nodded.
Shift changes when the sun goes down, he explained. I tried to call them up when I spotted the mob and heard the explosions. Best I've been able to make out is a few of the boys pulled the civilians in town there, made their own Main Street Alamo.
What about the mayor? Jackie asked.
The cowboy shook his head.
Been trying to get him on the line for the last 20 minutes, he said. Was coordinating with him, but he went quiet.
We're going to have to divide and conquer, Landry said. Sparks, do you think you can take care of the house? She nodded.
Yeah, I'll get them and start pushing up Main Street. Figure out some way to clear this mob, she said, then turned to the cowboy. I'm assuming your men don't have the bullets to clear them out?
Hell no, girl,
the cowboy scoffed.
Nowhere close.
How the hell are we going to do this?
She murmured under her breath, thinking hard. Landry pulled out the explosives bag and held it out to her.
"Still got these," he said.
She nodded, taking the bag with a smile.
"There we go," she said, and looked up. "Hey, what's the biggest building you have in town?"
"We got a little convention center just on the other side of the neighborhood," he said, motioning vaguely with his hand.
"Think 1,000 of those things could fit inside?" Sparks asked.
He shrugged.
"Might be a little tight, but yeah," he replied.
"What are you thinking?" Jackie asked.
The redhead motioned with her hand as she spoke.
"Get 'em in and level the building," she said simply.
"That enough explosives to pull it off?" Landry asked. She opened the bag and pulled out a charge.
"The other 2 conceal them inside, and this one is incendiary," she explained. "Trap 'em and roast 'em."
Everyone looked around at each other, essentially fishing for a better idea, but nobody had one. Landry sighed and shrugged. "All right, that's the play," he said, and held up the cheap walkie-talkie from earlier. "When you get it going, give me a call on this. They might be listening in on the other channels." Sparks nodded, making sure hers was accessible.
"Where are you going?" she asked. "I don't know about him, but I'm going to the courthouse," Jackie cut in. "My friends are there, and those convicts, Kai especially, have a bone to pick with Captain Ditko."
Landry nodded. "Guess I'm going to the courthouse too," he said. "It's right in the center of town, so if you need a hand, you call." Sparks nodded and secured the goods.
"If you're going to the courthouse, your best bet is to ride right alongside the train here until you get level with downtown," the cowboy suggested. "The side streets are probably a little clearer than the main drag."
"Good luck, Sparks," Landry said. She nodded firmly.
"You too," she said,
then looked up at her new comrade.
"You stay put, old-timer. Can't say for sure, but a couple of our friends might be coming along. They're military like him, a man and a woman."
"If they come this way, I'll point them in the right direction,"
the cowboy promised. Sparks nodded, and the trio took off towards their respective destinations. Chapter 5. Sparks rode her horse up towards the neighborhood, stopping a few blocks short when she saw a mob of ghouls on the road. She looked up at the road sign, finding she was on Den Rock. She hopped off, pulling her gear off of the horse before smacking it and setting it free.
"Run free, girl," she said. "Not going to tie you up and make you a zombie buffet."
As the horse took off to safer pastures, Sparks checked her sidearm and her assault rifle, before slinging the latter over her shoulder and drawing her knife. She took a knee on the side of the road and surveyed the situation. There were several rows of houses, but she suspected the target house was up 3 blocks. It was a large 2-story house to her right, with about 100 zombies outside of it. Smoke unfurled from the front of it, like there had been some sort of explosion recently. The house wasn't on fire, but ghouls mobbed around towards the front. Outside of the mob was a smattering of monsters in the road, about 24 over the next few blocks who were off wandering about in their own little world. Past that, she could see the faint outline of downtown, the moon just bright enough to show there were a ton of creatures all over the roads.
"Another problem for later," she thought. "First things first. Get the people out of that house."
She moved to the backyards of the houses, most of them with no fences, just wide open areas. She moved up a couple of blocks pretty quickly, hopping over the occasional fence but not encountering any resistance. Sparks paused across the street from the block where the target house was, 3 doors down from the corner. Unlike the previous houses, there was a significant gathering of creatures around the back, trying to get into the door. A shot went off, and she looked up towards the house, finding a cowboy with a rifle sticking out of the second-floor window. He aimed down, firing into the mob, taking his time with each shot. However, the noise he was making caused a few more creatures to come into the backyard, which just made the situation worse. Sparks spotted a fence beside the target house yard and darted across the street, staying within the shadow of a large tree in the neighboring yard to cover her movement, as there were several zombies at the cross street just to her left. She made it across, hopping the fence and making it to the other side, taking a knee beside the short brick wall fence which came up to the top of her thighs, if she was standing up. The moonlight shone directly onto her, so she raised her knife up, reflecting it towards the house. It took the cowboy several moments before he noticed her. They both waved at each other before she motioned for him to speak. He stared at her in confusion for a few moments before he realized what she wanted.
"Don't know who you are, but glad you're here," he finally called. "We got 15 people in here, mostly civilians. Something exploded by the front door earlier and ripped it off its hinges, but we managed to plug the hole for now. We tried to get out the back, but those things were waiting on us here, too. It looks pretty clear that way if we can get past this group here. You think you can help?"
Sparks nodded and mimicked a gun shooting while shaking her head no and pointing at him. His brow furrowed and he shook his head.
"You don't want me to shoot?"
he asked. She nodded and gave him a thumbs up.
"Okay," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "What do you want me to do?"
She thought for a moment about how to properly motion for him to go downstairs, and eventually, with a series of hand movements and repeating a few times, he seemed to get it.
"You want me to get them ready to move?" he asked.
She nodded with another thumbs up.
"Give me 3 minutes, and we'll be ready to go," he declared.
Another thumbs up, and she watched him vanish in through the window again.
"Okay, now what?" she thought. "You have to get them away from the door. How?"
Sparks thought hard as she looked around the yard she was in. There was a small outbuilding made of cheap metal. She ran over and quietly opened the door, which, luckily, wasn't locked.
"Gotta love that small-town trust,"
she thought as she went inside. She quietly shut the door behind her, looking around. There was the usual assortment of yard maintenance tools, along with some larger items. She looked through the shed, picking up a large axe and tossing it aside.
"That might come in handy," she thought,
and then spotted a lawnmower. A grin spread across her face as she opened up the gas tank, finding that there was still some fuel left.
"This'll have to do."
She rolled the lawnmower out, priming the tank before giving the handle a pull. The motor chugged for a brief second before dying. She gave it another pull, and it started for a few seconds before falling silent. Zombies around the house began to take notice and shamble towards her, and she grunted.
"Come on, start!"
she urged, and gave it one more hard yank. The lawnmower sprang to life, blowing out a bit of smoke before steadying itself and humming loudly. It was an older mower, and shook a fair amount, but it was on, and that was what mattered. By this point, about a dozen zombies had broken away from the pack and moved towards the small concrete fence. A couple of the creatures reached it and tumbled over as they reached out, landing hard on the ground. Despite the noise the mower was making, the other few dozen zombies weren't budging from the back door. Sparks looked over to the building and moved the mower next to it, shoving it hard into the side. The machine dented the metal building, wedging in place, and mixed with the violent shaking of the old engine, created a horrific sound that echoed throughout the neighborhood. This got the attention of most of the zombies at the back of the house, and they turned and began to move towards the fence. Sparks rushed over, picking up the axe and getting ready to fight. She didn't want to leave until the people were out safely, just in case something went wrong. She stepped up to the first ghoul that had toppled over the fence, now getting back to its feet. She swung the axe across her body, catching the zombie in the side of the head. The impact was violent, piercing through half its skull and putting it down for good. She yanked it free and took a step back as the next creature lunged forward. She used the opportunity to step to the side and swing the axe, flat side out, hitting the zombie in the top of its back. The momentum coupled with the push sent it to the ground, where Sparks quickly brought the blade down into the back of its skull. She glanced back, seeing half a dozen creatures now on her side of the fence, several of them already to their feet. She left the axe alone, pulling out her handgun and aiming carefully, the moonlight bright enough to let her pick her target. Before she fired, She looked past them to make sure no humans were in her line of fire. They were still inside the house, so she let loose. She took careful aim, squeezing the trigger at a deliberate pace, dropping the creatures one by one. After the third one dropped, the back door opened and people began to come out of the house. Sparks holstered her gun and broke out her knife, stabbing the closest monster in the eye and shoving it back into the path of a few others. She stood her ground, stepping forward and attacking before shoving the creature towards the mob and jumping back to safety to reset. This dance with the dead went on for several moments as she watched the people evacuate the house, making it to the fence at the back, which was taller than the side fencing. Sparks dispatched a couple more creatures before looking over, finding the window cowboy waving to her. She killed one more zombie before running straight back the way she came, staying in the backyards to lure the ghouls in her direction. When she hit the road, she glanced back and found only a few ghouls were following her, with the majority of them staying in the yard, attracted to the sound of the lawnmower. She headed back down the road, making the turn on the next block and finding a group of 15 people in the middle of it. There were 11 civilians, mostly older, with 4 cowboys standing guard around them. Sparks ran up and the window cowboy lowered his weapon as she approached. "Ma'am, you're a sight for sore eyes," he said with a tired smile. "And you got bigger balls than any of us here. That was a hell of a risk back there." She shrugged. "That's tame compared to some of the shit I've pulled recently," she said. "Ma'am, I'm Ed, and we can't thank you enough," he said, holding out his hand. She shook it and then raised her palm. "You can stop with all the ma'am stuff," she said firmly. "Call me Sparks. Now, listen. We're in a hell of a lot of trouble, and I need your help." "Whatever you need, ma'am," he said, then coughed. Sparks." "Nice catch," she said with a grin. "Now look, it should be mostly clear to the edge of town. One of you needs to escort anybody who can't fight to the train. Get them up there until we can sort this out." Ed turned to one of his men and inclined his head. "Go, now," he said. The man nodded and motioned for everyone to follow him, and they quickly ran off into the darkness of the neighborhood. "We've been hearing a lot of bad things on the radio," Ed said. "Downtown's a battlefield. Who's doing this to us?" Sparks shook her head. "A few convicts who aren't happy with Ditko," she said. "Now listen. I got a plan, but I'm going to need help." "Name it," Ed said with a sharp nod. "Where is the convention center?" she asked. He motioned over his shoulder. "You go straight up the main road over there, hang a left, and it's up on the right after a ways," he explained. "Why?" "Because that's where we're pulling these things to," she said. "But we need to get the place ready for them." His brow furrowed, but he looked interested. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I need the biggest entrance opened wide, preferably the one facing the road," she said. "One way in, no way out, so the other doors need to be locked up tight, chained if necessary." He nodded slowly. "There's a big loading dock door facing the road," he said. "How big?" she asked. "Big enough to roll a couple of trucks through," he said with a shrug. "Let's get that open," Sparks instructed. "And we're going to need something that makes a hell of a lot of racket to go inside. Alarm bells, sirens, radio, doesn't matter. The louder, the better." He paused for a moment in thought before turning to his waiting men. "You know that new apartment complex that's on the other side of it?" he asked, and they nodded. "One of the officers on the force lived out there. His car should still be there in the parking lot." "Where are we getting the keys at?" one of them asked. Ed shook his head. "No time for that. Just break out the window and push it up there and get it inside," he instructed, and held up his radio. "When I give you the signal, you hit the cherries and get the hell out. Battery should be good on it, at least for as long as we need it. Go, now." The 2 men ran off to do their job, and Ed turned back to Sparks. "Okay, you have any idea on how we're going to pull those things away from town?" he asked. "It's easily a mile or so from where they are to where they need to be, and I don't think your lawnmower trick is going to do it this time." She thought for a moment, looking around. "We need to find the men who let these things into town," she said. "They have a ton of dynamite, which is what they use to lure them here. If we can get that, we can do the same thing." "I got you covered," Ed said, and pulled out his walkie-talkie.
She put her hand over it before he could say anything. "We have to assume they're listening," she said. He smirked. "They're not listening to who I'm calling," he assured her. She shrugged and pulled her hand back, motioning for him to continue. He changed the channel and clicked it on. "CC, you there?" Ed asked.
"Loud and clear, buddy,"
An older man came back.
"Had a feeling you might be calling."
Ed smiled and asked, "What's your 20?
"Same place I'm always at,"
came the reply.
"Good man,"
Ed said, and let go of the talk button.
"He's an old-timer who lives in a concrete building by the train tracks. Been there since the dawn of time."
Sparks nodded and motioned for him to continue.
"Okay, CC, I need your eyes and ears," Ed said into the radio. "We're looking for some outsiders who are causing some trouble."
"Well, I ain't got eyes on them, per se,"
the old man replied.
"But I got a good idea of where at least one of them boys is at."
"That's a good start," Ed replied. "What you got?"
"Pretty sure they're holed up in the old gym on Main Street,"
CC said. The cowboy's brow furrowed.
"Why do you say that?" he asked.
"Well, I can't see it from my place, but your boys up on the train have been shooting in that direction for the last 15 minutes or so,"
the old man explained. Ed shrugged.
"You sure they aren't shooting at those things?" he asked.
CC barked a laugh through the receiver.
"Lord, no," he drawled.
"I know them boys,
and they'd be lucky to hit a headshot at point-blank range. Ain't no way they're trying to take out one of them buggers from that far away, especially at night."
His laughter subsided.
"Nah, they shooting at somebody who's taking shots at them, and I can guarantee you they stuck too. Road's thick with those critters. They ain't getting out the front."
"What about the back?" Sparks asked. Ed nodded.
"Could they have gone out the back?" he asked through the radio.
"Could be, but your boys are still ducking, so I think he's still there,"
the old man explained. Ed pursed his lips, addressing Sparks.
"Why would he stay there?" he asked.
"Maybe buying some time," she mused with a shrug. "His friends are going after the mayor and Captain Ditko." Ed hit the button on the radio.
"Okay, bud. Thanks for your help," he said. "You hang tight, and when we get through this, I owe you a bottle of the good stuff."
"Damn straight, Eddie," CC replied. "You stay safe."
Sparks smirked as Ed pocketed the walkie-talkie. "He seems colorful," she said.
"You don't know the half of it,"
Ed replied, shaking his head. "Can you get us to the gym?" she asked.
"Gonna have to take the back way in," he replied. "It's on Main Street, and about a block up from the train tracks. With all that noise—"
She nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's going to be crowded up there," she said.
"Come on, follow me,"
he said, and led her back into the neighborhood. They'd have to cross over the highway before making their way up towards the gym, hoping that they were in time to catch the gunman before he could escape into the night. Chapter 6. Jackie and Landry made their way towards the courthouse from the backside. As they came up, there were several zombies in their way, spread out over the next 2 blocks leading up to the building. "Let's keep it quiet, but take them down," Landry said softly. "If they see us coming up, I don't want to fight a 2-front war." Jackie nodded. "I'll follow your lead," she said. He nodded, and the 2 of them readied their knives as they ran through the parking lots of the small offices and buildings leading up to the courthouse. They broke away from one another as Landry pointed to the ones he wanted Jackie to deal with. Both of them had an easy time with their targets, quickly stabbing them in the head and shoving them aside. Luckily, they were all spread out several yards apart, in some cases much further than that, allowing for a simple disposal. After taking out a dozen or so creatures between the 2 of them, they took cover next to a small concrete building that led up to the courthouse, just across the street. They looked out, finding 6 creatures in the road, followed by a wide-open path to the door. The door was another matter, however, as there were 12 creatures in front of it, most of them trying to navigate the tall stone staircase leading up. "That looks like a bitch and a half," Landry murmured. "Even if those things weren't there, they were probably smart enough to lock those doors." You know of any other way into this place? Yeah, the main entrances are on the side and on the main street side, Jackie explained. That's not going to do us any good, Landry said, shaking his head. Way too exposed if we go that way. Jackie thought for a moment, pursing her lips hard, and then snapped her fingers in excitement when she thought of something. There's an employee entrance on the right-hand side, she said. Only reason I know it's there is because they took us out it once when we were going for food. So unless you were told it was there, Landry trailed off. She grinned. You probably aren't aware it exists, she finished. If any door is going to be unlocked, it's going to be that one, he replied. Let's go get them then, she said excitedly. Hang on, Landry said, holding up a hand. Look, I know you're capable, but I need you to follow my orders in there, okay? She stared down her nose at him. I can handle myself, she said dryly. I know, but have you ever done a raid like this? He asked, motioning to the courthouse. Breaching a hostile-controlled building? She sighed. Outside of breaking into a bar to confront a shady promoter, can't say that I have, she admitted. Well, I have, Landry said. It could get messy, especially since there are people you care about in there. And Ditko, she quipped. He chuckled. Yeah, him too, he said. Don't worry, I'm not going to lose my head in there, Jackie promised. You give the orders, and I'll follow them. Good deal, Landry replied. You ready? She nodded. We taking those things out? She asked. Not going to worry about it with our breach point, he replied, shaking his head. If we get stuck and followed up the stairs, it should be easy enough to fight them off. Lead the way, Jackie said. Landry led the duo alongside the front of the building, staying in the shadows as much as possible. They broke across the street down a small alley once they saw the entrance they were going for. They ran quickly, staying in the shadows as much as they could. Their footsteps on the pavement alerted a few zombies, but they were far enough away that they weren't much of a threat. Landry made it to the staircase first, aiming his handgun upwards as they moved up, with Jackie covering their rear with her handgun. She looked back from the direction they'd come in, and the zombies were shambling towards them, but still a good 20 or 30 yards away. Landry made it up to the door, which had a simple pull handle on it. He took a deep breath, saying a silent prayer to himself before pulling on it. He breathed a sigh of relief when the door cracked open and didn't make a squeaking sound. He peeked inside at a long hallway leading all the way to the other side of the building, with offices to the left and some hallways and an entrance to the right. It was dark, with emergency battery-powered lights in the corners and middle, providing illumination. Landry let out a clicking sound to get the attention of Jackie, motioning with his head for her to come up. They perched at the entrance of the building. Okay, when we get in there, close this door as quietly as you can, he whispered. After that, you cover the left side. If anybody pops out of those offices, you fire. It's dark as hell in there, just some emergency lighting. Chances are you're going to miss, but it'll send them back to where they came from. Jackie nodded. Okay, she whispered back. Landry moved into the building, quickly aiming his gun downrange, ready to take out anything that moved. Jackie got inside and quietly shut the door, taking her position and covering the doors to the left. They moved down the hallway silently, pausing at the first hallway entrance. Landry peeked down it, finding a stairwell leading to a landing, and a much larger stairwell going to the first floor. He motioned for her to move up as he covered the stairwell before moving across. As soon as he made it to the other side, he held up a hand to get her to stop. He could hear voices coming from downstairs. They both strained their ears, but couldn't make out what was being said. The only thing they could understand was that the tone was angry. Whoever was talking wasn't happy. Landry motioned for Jackie to follow him as they walked down the stairs, both of them tense and aiming their guns towards the first floor. They made it most of the way down the stairs, stopping just before the landing, so they could try and get a better sense of where the noise was coming from. Landry peeked his head out,
looking at the first floor and seeing a big source of light, too bright to be coming from emergency lighting. It appeared to be coming from one of the courtrooms on the first floor, the door to it wide open. The voice was yelling now, and a little clearer. Jackie recognized Kai's voice and tapped Landry on the shoulder, nodding and pointing that they were targeting the right group. He led her down the main stairs towards the courtroom, moving slow and quiet, the soldier ready to strike as soon as he spotted an enemy. When they made it to the ground floor, the door to the courtroom was about 15 yards away. The yelling inside was intense, Kai barking expletives, which were only interrupted by the sound of flesh on flesh. Landry looked around at the office across the hall, where the door stood open. He aimed his gun inside, making sure nobody was in there before resuming his sentry stance. He stopped and contemplated for a moment before motioning to Jackie to take cover in there. She was confused before Landry made a few hand gestures, informing her that she would be his backup. She nodded that she'd be ready. He waited until she was set, taking a knee by the wall several feet back from the doorframe. She had a clear view of the hallway, but it was far enough back that nobody would be able to see her until it was too late. Landry moved up to the courtroom door, peeking inside through the opening. The mayor, Alonzo, and Ethan sat in the jury box opposite to Landry. Arthur stood guard next to them with a rifle. Captain Ditko sat tied to a chair in the middle of the room, bloody and broken. Kai paced back and forth in front of him, every once in a while punching him again.
"You just had to pull that deal, didn't you?"
Kai snarled.
"You little prick."
He punched the slumped man's guts, eliciting a low wheeze.
"Bet you wish you had stuck to it now, don't you?"
"Come on, you made your point,"
the mayor said shakily from the jury box.
"You sit your fat ass down and keep your mouth shut,"
Kai spat, whirling and pointing a finger at him.
"Unless you want attention from these fists."
Collier closed his mouth, staring down at his shoes and shaking his head.
"Yeah, that's what I thought,"
Kai declared, and turned back to Ditko. He leaned down, getting right in his quivering face before leaning forward to whisper something in his ear. While he was distracted, Landry glanced over and made eye contact with Alonzo, who managed to catch his eye. Landry pointed to the ground, and Alonzo gave the slightest of nods to acknowledge he understood. A few seconds later, before Kai could go back to punching Ditko, Alonzo let out a yell, moving to the side and knocking the other two off their seats to the ground. As Arthur raised his weapon, Landry aimed and fired, hitting him in the shoulder and dropping him to the ground. Kai whirled around, and upon spotting Landry in the doorway, he moved away from Ditko, drawing his handgun from his back belt and firing several bullets towards the soldier as he slid over and behind the prosecution table. Landry returned fire before backing away from the door for cover. Kai didn't waste time, leaping up and pursuing Landry out of the courtroom. When he reached the doorway, he fired blindly to cover himself, hitting nothing but air.
"Missed me, bitch,"
the soldier teased. Kai let out a frustrated yell before leaping out into the hallway, turning towards the stairs, aiming his weapon, and trying to find the target. Landry heard his footsteps on the marble floor, slowly moving towards the stairs. Landry was out of harm's way at the top of the stairs off to the side.
"Honestly, I'm kind of surprised you've survived this long, given how shitty of a shot you are,"
Landry taunted. Kai snarled.
"Don't worry. I won't be able to miss when I shove this thing right up your—"
Jackie didn't hesitate as he crossed the entrance of the office door, pulling the trigger and sending a round into the ex-convict's side. He dropped to the ground in pain, dropping his weapon, and she scrambled forward, kicking the weapon away while holding the moaning man at gunpoint.
"I got him,"
she called. Landry descended the stairs, surveying the situation.
"I'm disappointed, Jackie,"
Kai groaned.
"Can't believe you shot me and took Ditko's side."
She shook her head.
"I took my friend's side," she said. "I don't give two shits about Ditko."
He coughed up some blood, his expression telling her he didn't believe her.
Is it safe out there? Alonzo called from the courtroom. Yeah, you're good, Zoe, Jackie called back. Alonzo, Mayor Collier, and Ditko emerged from the courtroom, Ethan presumably staying behind to keep an eye on Arthur. The captain attempted to straighten, though he still had an arm curled around his gut, blood all over his face.
Yeah? How's that feel, convict?
He said with a sneer.
I hope it hurts, and I really hope that you enjoyed that little taste of freedom, because you're going to live out the rest of your days in solitary.
Jackie raised her chin, glaring at him. That's not going to happen, she said firmly. Ditko waved his hand dismissively.
Whatever, girl. You don't get a say,
he said, keeping his hungry eyes on Kai. This made it all the more easy to pistol whip his nose, knocking him to the floor. Do you have any idea what I've had to go through because of you? She demanded, staring down at his surprised face. I've been beaten, shot at, beaten some more. I haven't had a good meal or a good night's sleep in God only knows how long. All because you wanted to be a big swinging dick. Well, let me tell you, you don't get to say shit to me. He spat out a mouthful of blood, sneer still firmly in place.
You better watch your mouth, little girl,
he said. Little girl? Jackie huffed, staring at the ceiling, halfway between laughing and screaming. Little girl? Did you just... She looked at Landry, question in her exasperated gaze. Landry shrugged, giving her a nod. She smirked, turning her gaze back on Ditko, who somehow still looked confident, even covered in wounds.
Yeah, little girl, he taunted. You aren't going to do a single damn...
Jackie fired, and as her bullet shattered his kneecap, his confidence melted into hysterics as he writhed in pain, screaming incoherent obscenities. I may be a little girl, but you're a little bitch, she snapped. Quit your crying. She turned and took a knee beside Kai, offering him a smile. See, I told you I wasn't on his side. Kai cracked a smile, but winced in pain at the bullet still in him. She glanced back at the mayor and Alonzo, both staring at her in shock. Oh, don't give me that look, she scoffed. You know he had that coming.
Jackie,
Collier stammered.
I don't know what to do about this.
It's simple, Landry cut in. Lock the two convicts in the office over there. Put Ditko in the courtroom, and keep them apart while we go deal with the mess outside. Once we save the day, we'll deal with these two.
Okay, but
The mayor choked on his own words, shaking his head.
I don't know if I can let you stay in this town, Jackie. Not after this.
She laughed. Don't worry, Mr. Mayor. As soon as it's clear, I'm out of here, she promised. Move them now. We have to go deal with everything else, Landry urged.
I can help with that,
Kai said from the floor. Appreciate the offer, but I think you've done enough for today, the soldier said dryly. Kai waved him off weakly.
Not literally help you,
he said, sarcasm evident despite a hiss of pain.
I'm in no condition to do so. I mean, I can tell you where we parked.
Jackie and Landry glanced at each other. You wouldn't happen to still have some dynamite in the truck, would you? Jackie asked. He nodded with a smile.
Thought it might come in handy,
he said. I'll get the location, Jackie said. You get Sparks on the line. Landry nodded and stepped away, pulling out the walkie-talkie. Sparks, come in, he said. We got a way to get the town clear. There was nothing but silence, and his heart rate picked up. Sparks, you copy? He demanded, but still silence. He shook his head as he turned back to the others. I got nothing. Sure it's working? Jackie asked. Before he could answer, an explosion erupted in the distance just a couple of blocks away. Landry ran to the door, looking out towards downtown. He couldn't see where it came from, only that the zombies that had been hanging out in front of the courthouse were turning and shambling towards the far end of downtown. Sparks! Landry yelled into the radio. Sparks! There was still no answer, and he shoved the walkie-talkie into his pocket. We gotta move, now!
Jackie, go straight back out of the courthouse. Keep going until you hit the train,
Kai said quickly.
Go through it, and the truck is parked behind the plaza place on the other side of the highway."
She smiled at him. "Thanks," she said, and he nodded as Alonzo pushed him into the office. She turned to Landry. "Let's go." They rushed towards the back exit, hoping they weren't too late for Sparks.
Chapter 7. 10 minutes earlier. Ed and Sparks made their way up towards the gym, coming in from a couple of blocks away from town. When they were parallel with it and started moving back towards town, they readied themselves with knives and guns in hand. In the distance, there was an occasional exchange of gunfire, letting them know the shooter was still inside. They made it within a block of the building, finding a few zombies that had wandered around the back.
"Which one is it?" Sparks asked.
"Second door from the left,"
he replied. "Is it going to be open?" she asked. He nodded.
"Should be," he said. "After the bikers attacked us, we talked it over as a town and decided that a door like that should be left open. Felt like nobody should die just because they didn't have their keys on them."
"Okay," she said. "Follow me."
He put his arm on hers.
"I can lead the way, ma'am,"
he offered. "No offense, cowboy, but I've done a lot more of this than you," she said with a smile. "Just follow my lead, okay?" Her tone was both thankful and dismissive, but it did the job, and he nodded in agreement. "Knife kills only," she continued. "If that shooter is still inside, I don't want to let him know we're there until it's too late for him to do anything about it."
Ed nodded, and the two of them broke out from cover, moving at a brisk but deliberate pace, which helped them keep the noise down. There were a handful of creatures in the back parking lot of the building, and they stepped up and quickly took them down with knife strikes. This attracted half a dozen more, which were bunched up pretty tightly. Sparks built up a head of steam, leaping and delivering a forceful front kick to the lead one, which knocked several of them. As she took care of the fallen, Ed came around, grabbing one of them by the shirt and flinging it behind him with such force that the zombie stumbled and face-planted on the pavement. This allowed Ed to take out the other two with rapid strikes. Once he downed those two, he turned and kicked the other one that was struggling to get up, jamming his knife into the back of its skull. The two exchanged a glance, nodding to each other that they were ready to go. They moved up to the door, with Ed as the opener and Sparks covering with her handgun, ready to breach. With a nod, he opened it up, and they slipped inside silently. They entered at the back of the gym, which was a large open area. The front glass was partially blocked with wood, a hasty repair made from the car that crashed through back when all this began. Sparks motioned for Ed to duck down with her behind a large piece of equipment. They looked towards the front, which was where the only light was coming in via the moon. A single figure ducked down over there, reloading a rifle as a few shots rang out in the distance from the other cowboys on the train. Sparks motioned for Ed to go to the front counter, which was about 15 yards away, for some more cover and to flank the shooter. She remained in the same position, still ready to strike. As Ed moved over, he inadvertently banged his knee on one of the machines, which sent a loud clank across the room. The biker at the front of the room turned and spotted him, immediately aiming and firing his gun. Ed took off running, diving for cover behind the counter as bullets ripped it to shreds. Sparks took aim and fired, narrowly missing the biker, who quickly took cover behind a large weight machine.
"Ed, you good?"
she called. "Yeah," he replied.
"Start shooting then," she barked.
"Yes, ma'am,"
he replied as he popped up from behind the counter, opening fire and pinning the biker down. This allowed Sparks to move up in the gym and to her left, away from the cowboy, taking cover behind more equipment. As soon as Ed stopped shooting, the biker stepped up and started firing towards Ed while saving a few shots for where he thought Sparks was. As he did this, she took aim at him, her eyes straining from the lack of light, but there was just enough to provide a silhouette. Sparks squeezed the trigger, hitting him once and dropping him. She stayed at the ready position, making sure he didn't get back up. Several seconds went by before she got up from behind cover. Another shot went off in the distance.
"Ed, tell them to stop shooting," she cried. "I don't want to catch a bullet from one of them." "Cease fire to the gym," he demanded into his radio. "Cease fire." "Copy that," someone said on the other end. "You're good," Ed called. Sparks slowly worked her way up to the fallen biker, whose legs were still moving. "Just keep your hands where I can see them and I won't shoot again," she warned. There was no answer from her opponent, just some light moans and movement from him. She finally came around the equipment, ready to strike if necessary. It took a moment for Sparks to understand what she was seeing, and by the time she did, it was too late. The biker was on his back, no gun in hand, only holding a lit lighter and a stick of dynamite. She fired at him, but it was as he tossed the lit stick in her direction. "Ed, get down!" she screamed as she rushed away from the explosive, diving behind a rack of dumbbells standing freely. As soon as she landed, it detonated, sending an ear-splitting sound throughout the enclosed room. The concussion of the blast ripped out the front of the building, destroying the windows and knocking the zombies back. Even through the glass and safety stuff, it was no match for the explosive. Sparks was stunned, her ears ringing, head pounding, covered in debris. It was dark, the dust flying up, blocking up what little bit of moonlight tried to bathe them. She was startled when a figure appeared over her, causing her to instinctively fight, knowing there were zombies nearby. But she calmed when it was Ed firing his handgun, while reaching down to pull her up off of the ground. Sparks tried to snap out of it, shaking the cobwebs from her head as he continued to fire towards the mob of ghouls pouring into the building. Finally, she got enough of her wits about her to reach down, grabbing her handgun off of the floor and opening fire. The light was nearly non-existent, so the two of them were firing at shadows that were slowly moving towards them and getting closer, within just a couple yards of them. Finally, both realized they needed to just get out of there. Ed pulled her along as she pointed her gun back, firing a few more shots. They made it to the back door and shoved it open, only to be greeted by several zombie arms. Ed was swallowed up by a ghoul, and Sparks burst out the door, kicking one out of the way to go after Ed. Zombie arms wrapped around him, but just before teeth met flesh, she fired at near point-blank range, ripping the head clean off of the corpse. The cowboy regained his composure, shooting a few nearby creatures, giving them the breathing room they needed. "Are you okay?" he asked. "What?" Sparks asked, rubbing her ears, trying desperately to get rid of the ringing. "I said, are you okay?" he asked again, louder. She watched his mouth and nodded, giving him a thumbs up. She said, still a little dazed. He grabbed her hand. "We gotta get to someplace safe," he urged. Things had gone all wrong, and not according to plan, and she knew she had to just follow him. They ran a block up, and he walked up to the front door of a small house just off from downtown. He opened it and pulled her inside, locking it up tight before clicking on a camping lantern and shutting the curtains so no light would escape. She sat on the sofa, still a little dazed. Ed came over, getting into her face to inspect her, and she waved him off. Relax, he said gently. "Just giving you a once-over." She complied, letting him do his thing. He brushed a little debris out of her hair and grabbed a facial tissue to dab up a little blood. "Nothing too bad," he said with a smile. "I think you'll make it." "Good to know," she replied hoarsely. "Thank you. We wouldn't have made it if you hadn't shown up," Ed said firmly. "Figured I owed you the same considerations." She nodded before reaching into her pocket and pulling out the low-level walkie-talkie. "Hope whoever you're calling on that is nearby," he said, brow furrowing. "That thing doesn't have much reach." "If they're not nearby, then we're in a lot more trouble than I want to contemplate," she said, and turned the volume all the way up, holding it close to her head. "Landry, you there?" "Holy shit, Sparks! I was getting worried over here," came the reply. "Did you hear that explosion?" She winced. "It was about 10 feet away from me when it went off," she said dryly. "Holy hell, how are you not dead?" Landry blurted. She couldn't help but laugh at that. "Big rack of heavy weights," she explained. "Guess it blocked enough of the concussion blast." "Glad to hear it," he said. "Yeah, well, you better add hearing aids to the shopping list. she said with a sigh. My ears are going to be ringing until the end of time. We'll get you some, girl. Don't worry, Landry promised. She took a deep breath. So, speaking of that explosion, that was a biker going suicide bomber on us, she said. Didn't leave anything useful behind. Don't worry about it. I got you covered, he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. We took care of the convicts and found out where their truck is. Sparks perked up, hope in her eyes. Did you get it? She asked. Jackie and I are heading to the edge of town now with a box full of the stuff, he replied. We're going to start pulling them our way. She made a victory fist. All right, good job, she commended. A couple of the cowboys I pulled out of the house should already be at the convention center getting it set up, blocking all but one entrance and setting up a police car inside to set the sirens off. You leave the hard part to us, Landry replied. You just get yourself up to the convention center and take a load off. Being on the business end of an explosion is no joke. She rubbed her forehead. Appreciate it, she said, then glanced at Ed. Is there anything directly across from the convention center? He nodded. Couple of small houses, he replied. She hit the button again. We'll be in one of the houses across the street, she said. We'll see you when you get there. See you soon, Landry promised. Sparks sighed, pocketing the radio. Looks like we might be in business after all, she said. Glad to hear it, Ed replied with a grin. Come on, pretty sure there's a couple of bikes in the backyard we can use. She chuckled. Nothing like a midnight bike ride through a zombie apocalypse, she quipped. He laughed. I promise, it'll be quaint, he joked. He held out a hand and helped her to her feet, and the two of them headed to the back to get their rides and head off to the rendezvous. Chapter 8. Sparks sat by the window, listening as the dynamite explosions got closer. As they did, Ed came over carrying a glass of water and held it out to her. Well, water, so should be a little tastier than the bottled stuff that's been sitting on the shelf for months, he said with a smile. She took it gratefully. Appreciate it, Ed, she said, and took a few sips, internally moaning at how right he was about the taste being good. After what you and your friends have done for this town, it's the least I can do, he said. They toasted and clinked glasses as Jackie and Landry came into view. They lit another stick and tossed it before turning towards the house and giving a thumbs up. Sparks raised a flashlight and clicked it a few times to signal back. Guess that's my cue, Ed said, and pulled out his walkie-talkie. All right, hit it, boys. A few moments later, the police lights and sirens started up inside the convention center across the street. The two cowboys came running out as Jackie lit up one more stick of dynamite, tossing it into the parking lot after they ran by. As soon as it landed, all of them came running over to the house as quickly as they could. They didn't want to give the zombies any reason to follow them, so they got inside and the cowboys hunkered down in front of the windows to watch. You okay, girl? Jackie asked as she sidled up next to Sparks. The redhead nodded. Yeah, I'll be fine, she assured her. Just might have to speak up if you want me to hear you for the next few weeks. They shared a laugh, and Sparks leaned over towards Landry. How'd it go on your end? She asked him. We saved the hostages and got the convicts locked up for the time being, he replied. Although, I don't think we're going to be able to stay much longer in town. Sparks blinked in confusion. Why? She asked. I kind of shot Ditko in the knee, Jackie said, wincing and shrugging. Come again? Sparks asked as all focus turned to Jackie. In my defense, he called me a little girl while he was talking down to me, the punk rocker added. Landry shrugged. I thought it was a reasonable response, he declared. Sparks' brow furrowed, concerned given that they were in a small house with 3 men from town. But the tension broke as Ed let out a cackle. I knew I liked you from the moment you got here, he said, clapping Jackie on the back. Can I get you something to drink? She blinked at him in shock, taken aback. Yes, please, she asked. Sparks raised her hands. Wait, you're really okay with her shooting one of your own? He asked. Oh, he is not one of us, Ed assured her. He's an uptight, condescending douchebag who thinks we all work for him. He never takes a shift on the wall and struts around barking out orders like he owns the place. I'm glad to know that if he does that in the future, all I have to do is kick the cane out from under him."
Sparks rubbed her forehead again.
"All right, good job, Jackie," she said.
Before anyone could comment, one of the men from the window turned.
"Those things are here," he said.
Everyone turned to watch the marching mob of rotting flesh hobble towards the sirens in the convention center. It was a long line, about a quarter-mile long. Once the front edge of the group noticed the noise, it was like they were leading a conga line. The mob marched diligently into the building, excited by the noise, jaws gnashing as if they were hoping for food at the source. The group watched with awe, hoping that the plan would work as intended. As the tail end of the zombies got there, the siren fell silent.
"What happened?" Jackie hissed. "Where's the noise?"
The group watched in horror as the zombies near the back, who were still about 20 yards from the entrance, stopped their march. Sparks reached into her bag, pulling out one of the explosive devices, tossing it to Landry.
"Get that door shut," she said.
He grabbed it and immediately rushed out the door as Sparks pulled out the other devices. Landry hit the grass of the yard, running hard while flicking his lighter. Finally, when he hit the road, he had to stop in his tracks to get the lighter to actually flick on. He was in the open and exposed, with several zombies getting within 10 yards of him.
"Come on, you son of a bitch," he urged.
He finally got the device to light, taking a couple of steps back to get up as much momentum as he could. He threw it with everything he had, watching it fly through the air, landing on the ground just a few yards away from the door. Landry slowly backed up into the road as the few dozen zombies near him continued to pursue, not wanting to make a sound until the device went off. Finally, it did, sending a massive fireball into the air. The damage to the building was significant, with a portion of the roof falling down into the opening. Landry gave an excited fist bump before he realized his fight was just beginning. He immediately pulled out his handgun, taking aim and opening fire on the nearby zombies. He was quickly joined by the cowboys and the girls, everybody brandishing weapons and opening fire on the creatures. It didn't take long for them to completely wipe out the threat, littering the parking lot with corpses. The group took a beat, realizing they'd dodged a major bullet. They all turned towards the convention center, the debris in front of the door, the zombies inside desperate to get out. The faint sound of metal scraping across concrete echoed, the debris pushed by the weight of the mob. Sparks tossed the incendiary device to Ed.
"That'll set the building ablaze," she said. "All you have to do is light it and get on the roof."
He grinned.
"Appreciate you giving me the honor," he said. "It's like a dream come true." "Your dream is to burn down the convention center?" she asked, shaking her head and rubbing at one of her ears, unsure she heard him correctly.
He smirked.
"I had my first job here," he explained. "Got fired for a bunch of BS."
She pulled out her lighter and fired it up, lighting the fuse.
"Enjoy your moment, then," she said.
Ed stepped up, throwing it as hard as he could. The device flew high through the air, vanishing up onto the roof. Several moments later, a giant fireball lit up the sky, sending smaller fireballs across the roof.
"That's fun,"
he declared.
"My friend Rufus is a mad genius," Sparks said. "This is one of his better ones."
Ed smiled and nodded as the group watched the building go up in flames. Within minutes, the entire roof was engulfed, a bright beacon in the night.
"Okay, a couple of you go around back. Keep watch to make sure none of them get out as the building collapses,"
Sparks instructed.
"It's unlikely, but we don't want any runners around here."
Ed nodded at his two cowboys, and they took off. "Sparks, we should really get a move on too," Landry urged. "Knowing Hammond and Whitaker, they could probably use our help." The redhead nodded.
"All right," she agreed. "I have no clue where my horse is, though."
Jackie held up a set of keys and jingled them.
"Don't worry. Kai kind of gave us the truck," she said. "Oh, my ass is saying thank you already," Sparks groaned happily. Ed, I don't know how you boys do that day in and day out. You get used to it, he replied with a shrug. Don't worry, I'll keep watch on this place until it's nothing but ash. Landry raised a finger. Could you do us one more solid? He asked. Ed nodded. Sure thing, he said. Make sure Ditko doesn't get any wild ideas and impound our plane, Landry asked. As much fun as shooting him looked, I'd rather not have to do it. Ed squared his shoulders. Don't worry, ever since Sparks filled me in on the full story, we're going to take real good care of him, he said. I mean, if you're going to kill him, we could always take him with us and drop him in the middle of the desert, Jackie said, and she was only half joking. Ed waved his hands back and forth in front of his face. No, nothing like that, he assured them. Let me ask you something. When you were a kid and spilled something on the floor because you were doing something stupid, what did your parents do? Beat the hell out of me and make me clean it up, Jackie replied, and then it dawned on her what he was implying, and she started laughing. Oh, I like that, she said. Take some pictures for me. Consider it done, Ed replied with a wink. Landry, Sparks, and Jackie started to walk back to the truck, breathing a sigh of relief that the job was done, and hoping Hammond and Whittaker had had just as much success as they did. Chapter 9. Landry stood by the highway just outside of downtown Dumas, a bag full of dynamite in a bag by his side, and a lighter in hand. In the other, he held his walkie-talkie. Everybody ready? He asked. Yeah, light it up, Hammond replied through the radio. Landry pulled out the last bit of the explosives that Rufus had built, lighting it up and throwing it towards the highway before taking cover. A few seconds later, it detonated, sending a massive amount of noise into the air. He walked out towards the road, looking back towards the town. The majority of the zombie mob was attracted to the noise, shambling in his direction. Looks like that got their attention, he said into the receiver. Good job, Hammond replied. Lure them about a mile up the road and double back. We should be ready to roll by then. Copy that, Landry replied. He looked up the highway, finding it empty. Nothing but road and desert, illuminated by moonlight. He sighed. Just another day in paradise, he murmured. As he kept the creatures occupied, Hammond, Whittaker, and Jackie were on the roof of the building, overlooking the gun store, while Sparks kept an eye on Kai and Arthur in the store below. This has been a hell of a day, hasn't it? The sergeant asked. Jackie barked a humorless laugh. Been a hell of a week, she said. Few days ago, I'm living the quiet life. Now I'm missing a finger and banished from a whole town. She paused for a beat, thinking about it. Actually, outside of the finger thing, this isn't the first time that's happened. The soldiers chuckled. How is your hand doing, by the way? Whittaker asked. Jackie looked at her hand, holding it up. Put fresh bandages on during the drive up here, she said. Still pissed about it, but I'll live. Good. Take care of that, Whittaker replied with a sharp nod. Pretty sure there's a drugstore a block up. Once we get these things cleared up, I'll help you get some stuff to tend to it. Jackie offered her a smile. Appreciate it, she said. The group stood and watched for the next half hour as the mob mostly cleared out, more explosions going off in the distance. Finally, there was just a smattering of zombies on the ground, and Hammond pulled out his radio. Hey, Axton, you still with us? He asked.
Yep, can't go anywhere quite yet,
came the reply. How many are in there? Hammond asked. There was a pause.
About a dozen or so, Axton replied. Spread out pretty good, but 4 are against the door.
Don't worry, we got you, the sergeant said. Hang tight and stay low.
Copy that,
Axton said. Hammond cocked his head. Jackie, you feel like joining us? He asked. Sure, let's do it, she said with a grin. The three of them packed up their weapons and headed down into the store where Sparks was hanging out with the 2 convicts. They all sat on displays,
nursing some bottles of water and packaged snacks. "Everybody good down here?" Hammond asked. Kai raised a hand with a wince.
"Could use some painkillers. But other than that—"
"We're hitting the drugstore after we get Axton out," Jackie said.
Whitaker nodded.
"We'll get you some good stuff," she promised.
He gave a thumbs up.
"Appreciate that," he said.
"Where are you off to?"
Sparks said, voice still a little louder than it should be. Hammond motioned across the road. "Pick off the stragglers and get their boss out of confinement," he said.
"We'll be here,"
Sparks said with a nod. Hammond clapped her on the shoulder and led the others out onto the pavement. Bodies were strewn about everywhere, only a small handful still on their feet. They didn't take chances, taking out handguns and firing as they walked, hitting the corpses in the heads as they strolled towards the entrance to the gun store.
"Nice night out here,"
Jackie said, the trio moving as casually as if the zombies were just a minor inconvenience. "Little cool for my taste," Hammond replied. Whitaker looked up.
"At least it's not snowing,"
she said. "True," Hammond agreed. They reached the broken storeroom door, pausing at the entrance to pull out flashlights. The sergeant went around first, handgun and light moving as a single unit with the other two behind them. They moved into the storeroom, each of them occasionally popping off a shot as they went, taking down a target. The noise attracted the ghouls from the other room, and they came shambling in, a few of them getting caught up in the remnants of the barricade that Whitaker had set up earlier. The trio stood their ground, carefully picking off the creatures as they came in. After several shots, Axton was yelling in the other room.
"We're clear in here,"
he called. "Well, come on out then," Hammond called back. The two men emerged from around the corner, hands in the air. "What the hell are you doing?" the sergeant asked dryly. "Put your hands down."
"Just wanted to make sure there wasn't any mistake in my intentions," Axton said. "We've come this far, after all."
Hammond raised his chin. "Jackie here says you're a man of your word, and I'm treating you like that's the case until you give me a reason otherwise," he said firmly. The two bikers lowered their arms as the punk rocker herself stepped out from behind the soldiers, facing them dead on. She searched Axton's face.
"Are you okay?"
she asked. He gave her a lopsided grin, not quite a smirk.
"I am. Thanks in large part to you," he said. "Heard you were sticking up for me."
She blushed a little, despite herself.
"Just doing what I thought was right," she said.
"Well, you saved a lot of lives because of that," he insisted. "I appreciate that more than you know."
"Come on, we got a couple more of you guys," Hammond said, waving for everyone to follow him. They emerged onto the road and the bikers looked around at the utter carnage.
"I'll say this about us," Axton drawled. "We can certainly cause a mess, can't we, Sergeant?"
Hammond chuckled. "Oh, you have no idea," he replied. When they entered the building, Arthur and Kai let out whoops, shuffling forward to greet Axton and Jimbo. The gang leader blinked in shock at the sight of them.
"Wouldn't have thought they would have left you two alive,"
Axton breathed, shaking his head.
"Wait, where's Carter?"
he asked, looking around.
"Didn't have any choice with him,"
Sparks said. He nodded.
"Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad," he said.
"Good to see you aren't heartbroken over it,"
Sparks said dryly. He raised his palms.
"Ma'am, don't misjudge me here. I'm sorry Carter is dead," he said sincerely. "But I understand you did what you had to do. And frankly, I'm thrilled these two are standing here now."
He turned to Kai.
"The question of the moment is, did you get to Ditko?"
Both men started laughing, and the gang leader stared at them blinking.
"I appear to be missing something,"
Axton said. Kai clutched his side, the laughing hurting him.
"Oh yeah, we got to Ditko all right," he groaned. "But we weren't the ones who did the most damage."
Axton shook his head, looking around the room.
"Well, don't keep me in suspense over here," he said.
Arthur cocked his head towards Jackie. "Your girlfriend over there shot him," he drawled. Axton's brow furrowed, in shock and confusion, but a bit of awe and pride as he turned to her.
She shrugged, fighting a smile. Only in the knee, she said. Axton burst out laughing.
Well, hot damn, girl,
he said, shaking his head.
I had no idea you had it in you.
He was a condescending prick who caused all this mess, she replied, as if it were the most casual thing in the world. I hit my breaking point with him. He wiped tears of mirth from the corners of his eyes.
Well, if anybody deserves to limp for the rest of their days, it's him, he said.
And he's going to think of me with every step he takes, Jackie declared. A chuckle rippled through the group, and Axton composed himself, leaning against a counter to face the entire group.
Well, Sergeant, I know you and your friends here have a long trip ahead of you, he said. So why don't we discuss our deal?
Jackie blinked. Deal? She asked.
Yeah, old Jimbo and I are still standing because I struck a deal with the sergeant here, Axton explained. We're going to take us a little field trip.
Hammond approached the counter, where there was a map of Texas flattened out. There were a few circles already, and he pointed to them as he spoke. Okay, our community here is Fabens, he said. For the time being, though, I think it's best if you and your gang hole up here in Del City. It's a small town, about the size of Dumas, but far enough away that the cartel scouts shouldn't be able to find you. Axton looked over the map, nodding slowly.
Supplies?
He asked.
Resistance?
We'll have it cleared out and stocked up for you by the time you get there, the sergeant said. How long you figure?
Gonna take us a few days around here to get loaded up and pull everybody back, Axton said. If we get lucky with gas, I figure we can be there in 4 or 5 days.
Hammond nodded. That gives us plenty of time to work, he said. We'll have you set up and ready to go by the time you get there. Jackie blinked rapidly. You're going to El Paso? She blurted.
Yes, we are,
Axton said, turning around to face her.
Seems as though the sergeant and his friends have gotten themselves involved in a cartel civil war, so we're going to go help them out.
She crossed her arms. I'm coming too, she said.
Oh, Jackie,
he said, gaze softening, an odd expression for the hardened biker.
I'd love to have you with us, but this is dangerous stuff. We're going to war down there.
She threw a hand over her shoulder. What do you think I've been doing the last few days? She demanded. Zombies, everybody trying to kill me, and it's not like I can go back to Dalhart with Ditko undoubtedly holding a grudge. Axton stared her down for a moment before nodding.
Well, anybody who's willing to shoot Captain Ditko is good enough in my books, he drawled. Welcome aboard, Jackie.
We should probably start loading up the truck with ammunition, Hammond suggested. Axton nodded.
And don't worry, Sergeant, he said. Whatever you leave behind, we'll be sure to bring with us. Pretty sure there's a truck rental place nearby. If it isn't bolted down, we're bringing it with us.
Whitaker raised a victory fist. No more begging for bullets, she said. I can get behind this. The group started moving, heading out for medical supplies and load-up. About an hour later, Landry made it back just in time to see the truck loaded up with guns and ammo. Axton and Hammond stood by the driver's side door, and the sergeant held out a hand. You travel safe now, he said. The gang leader grinned and shook.
You as well, Sergeant, he said.
Jackie approached. Hammond, will you do me a favor? She asked. He nodded. Of course, he said. Before you fly off, will you give Alonzo this? She asked, holding out a folded piece of paper. It's for him and Ethan. A goodbye letter. He smiled softly. Sure thing, Jackie, he said, pocketing it and getting into the driver's seat. We'll see you all in a few days. Axton nodded, and they stepped back as the soldiers got into the truck and Hammond sped off. The others stood there watching as they drove into the distance, until Axton clapped his hands together, grinning ear to ear as he looked down at the punk rock queen by his side.
Okay, let's get the rest of our boys and start loading up, he said, ready for the battle waiting on him. We have a road trip to get started on.
The end.